Okay, well, welcome back. Thank you for coming back so promptly. Today, as you know, and as we've said, and as we're experiencing, it's the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Riders. It happened on May the 4th, 1961, when 11 members of Congress of the Racial Equality Corps set out to challenge the Jim Crow laws and the continuation of segregation in the South. This became a tipping point in history, a defining moment for many of us. Today, from our panelists, we'll hear personal stories, including the role the media played at that time. We also hope to draw from these experiences that we too can learn lessons from this moment in history, which can carry us forward into our work as social workers. So, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panel. Firstly, Helen Singleton. Helen was involved in the civil rights movement from the beginning and was a Freedom Rider activist in the early 60s. As a rider in Jackson's, Mississippi, she was arrested, tried, fined, and incarcerated in Parchman Prison. Her story tells of these struggles, such as being a young woman of color at the time. The next panelist is Professor Ralph Fertig, and we all know Professor Fertig joined the ride on the 2nd of June 1961 from Montgomery, Alabama to Jackson, Mississippi, and was arrested in Selma, Alabama. He also experienced a time when segregation was prominent. Whites didn't mix with blacks, yet he did so freely as he wanted to help to end segregation and the injustice that segregation caused. And our last and final panelist member is Raymond Arsenault. Ray is a professional historian and an author of The Freedom Riders, 1961, and the struggle for racial justice. The movie is actually based upon the Freedom Riders, and this is taken mainly from the book that Ray has written. This is labeled as a definitive work. The book draws on unpublished writings of the Freedom Riders that have never been used before. So please, let's give a round of applause for our panelists. I will ask each individual panelist to speak for about 5 minutes about their experience. At the end of the presentation, we'll be opening up the floors for questions from the audience. So please have your question ready. So we'll start with Helen first. Helen?
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful, great size audience, and I'm glad to see you all here today. People have often asked me, why did you go on the Freedom Rides, knowing that you might be killed and might most definitely be harmed physically? And my answer is always that I had some experiences as a child, and I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's on the East Coast, and it's relatively north. But my mother is from Virginia. In fact, she's from Lawrenceville, Virginia, which is 17 miles north of the North Carolina border. So as a child growing up, and I'm the third child of 8 children, my mother and father would always take us down to Virginia to see my grandmother, her mother. My grandmother had a small farm down there, and it's something that American kids like to do. You like to go down to the farm to see your grandmama. It should be a lovely time. However, In order to get there, my mother would have to stay up all night cooking, frying chicken, baking rolls, making potato salad or vegetables or whatever the family would need in order to make this 14-hour drive from Philadelphia to Lawrenceville, Virginia. We would not be able to stop anywhere along the way and get served at a restaurant because we were black. We would not be able to go to a bathroom in a serving station. So she had to cook the food for the family every year and would take most of the night, and she, just as often as not, would be pregnant with the next child. And I would watch this, and she would complain about her feet hurt, she was hot, she was tired. And I thought, something's wrong with that. But we would go, and my father they would put us all in the back of the car. My father was a truck driver, and he liked to, what we call, mess around with cars. And so we never had a new car, but we always had something that he had put together so that we could make the trip. And back in those days, there was no interstate highway system like we have now. So that's why the trip took 14 hours. So we would get in the car, and I could always feel the tension in my father once we drove out of Washington, D.C. and headed into Virginia. Here was a man with a family who he couldn't protect. And if we needed to go to the bathroom, like I said, we would have to go on the side of the road. And being a girl, I just didn't like that at all. My brothers didn't mind it, but I didn't like it. And when we got to into Virginia, there was always other problems. Signs that said you couldn't go here. Signs that said we only serve whites. Blacks go around to the back. And I didn't like that either. My mother once sent us, my sister and I, to take a pan of cornbread, this is while we were down there, over to this white lady's house. I don't know what the agreement had been, but she sent us with this cornbread. And we went marching up to her front door, and we're going to hand her the cornbread. And she opened it, and she was in total shock. And she said, "Come around to the back, don't you know better?" And she slammed the door in our face. Well, needless to say, I didn't like that either. So as I grew up, in 1954, I was back in Philadelphia watching the McCarthy hearings. I don't know if you know anything about that at all. But we were watching the McCarthy hearings on my girlfriend's TV. Once again, I didn't have a TV. But the program was interrupted with the news that the Supreme Court had ruled that segregation in the schools was unconstitutional. And I thought, my goodness, they don't even go to school together down there. And I got married in 1955, and within 6 months, there was the murder of Emmett Till. And I don't know if you know all that, or what happened there. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old young black boy from Chicago whose mother had let him go down to Virginia to visit maybe not Virginia, but down south, Mississippi, to visit his family. And he had spoken in some unconventional way to a white woman, and he was lynched. He was tortured and lynched and put in a river. And it was all over the news, and it was just a terrible thing to have happened. Bob, my husband Bob, was in the Army, And they sent him to Germany, and I went with him. And while we were in Germany for 2 years, we met other white people from other parts of the world who didn't seem to have the same problem that white people in the United States had. And I thought that was quite interesting. And while we were there, we also met Africans who were just feeling flush from their own struggles for independence from the British. And they sort of looked derisively at us and what was going on in the United States. They said, well, why don't you all do something? And so these things occurred as I was growing up and becoming a young person, so that when the 1954 Montgomery boycott began to happen, I began to read about it. We sympathized with them, but that was local. It was in the city of Montgomery with respect to being able to ride a bus in that town and sit where you want. Then in 1960, the sit-ins occurred. And as Reverend Lawson spoke to you about it, that was also local, where they had several campaigns going on, integrating the movie houses, the lunch counters, the department stores. And that's another thing that I experienced when I was in Virginia growing up, was that only on Tuesdays could black people go into a department store in Virginia. And so these sort of things happen as you grow up. And I don't suppose I'm unique in the sense, because it happens to all black kids as they grew up in the United States. So when the call came out from the Congress of Racial Equality, and we had seen the buses getting burned. We saw the buses in Anniston and in Montgomery and Birmingham. It was all over the television, which was a new thing at that time for the news to be broadcast to most people's homes every night. I know I sound like I'm ancient, but anyway. When the call came out and they said they needed more freedom riders, because the original ones, some of them were still hospitalized and they couldn't go on, it was a no-brainer. It was an absolute no-brainer for me to want to go. Even though I had seen what had happened, I wanted to help to bring back some change.
Oh, thanks, Helen. Thank you so much. And the next person we'll have is Professor Fertig.
I was born into a family of German Jewish emigres and grew up in a community where we all hovered close to the radio when Franklin Roosevelt spoke, and we cheered on the armed forces of the United States because they were going to deliver the world from fascism and racism. And so I was exhilarated when the war ended and we had conquered these forces of evil. Then my family moved to the south side of Chicago, and I discovered that we had not defeated the forces of evil, that my neighbors were paranoid and panicked about the proximity of African American residents. And when I went to register for the local high school, there was a picket line out in front of the school, the only picket line I've ever crossed. They were objecting to the admission into the school of an African American kid whose family had moved into the district over the summer vacation. I pushed my way through that picket line, demanded that this young man who was sitting cringing on the principal's bench, that he and I both be admitted to the school. I was, he wasn't. And I had to fight my way back through that line, and every day after school, until I could conceive of ways of staying late, leaving early, sneaking outside entrances, and finally finding my way to the nearby African American community, which became a home for me, a refuge. And I realized that the struggle that my family had gone through was a struggle that we would have to go through in America, that we had not yet achieved that democracy, that social justice. The community that I wandered into had a settlement house, Parkway Community Center, and in that settlement house there was a group named CORE that met every Tuesday night. And so I came to know Jim Farmer and CORE, and I spent the next many years of my life working in civil rights causes and efforts. Was Secretary-Treasurer of the Chicago Freedom Action Committee. It raised money for Martin Luther King. We met him and he came by to raise funds for his stride for freedom, the Montgomery bus boycott. And it was in the course of this that the Freedom Rides emerged. And I got the call. Wyatt T. Walker called me, and I called back and I spoke with Dr. King. And after all these years of working on the edges, here I was being called into the trenches. And I had a moment's hesitation. And I asked Dr. King, well, won't I be seen as a meddler from up north? And of course I knew what he would say, and of course he said it. That none of us is free anywhere until all of us are free everywhere. And I was on the next plane. And I met Diane Nash and Julian Bond in Atlanta, and they went through a quick nonviolent training action workshop and got on the bus to Montgomery. And from Montgomery the next morning, you will see in the film the buses that went into Jackson, and mine was the very next bus after the first buses were taken. And we didn't know at that time that we wouldn't get past Jackson, that we'd have to fill up the jails in Jackson. But we did know about the perils. We knew what had happened in Anniston and in Birmingham and in Montgomery. You'll see all that in the film this afternoon. We got on board the bus after having symbolically desegregated the waiting room and the ticket counters and the lunch counter, and made a little bit of a stir in the bus station in Montgomery. A man came up to me, African-American guy, and he said, "Are you Freedom Riders?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, I've been fighting for my country. Now, how do I fight for my people?" I said, "Follow me." So I'd gone to the back of the bus, and I brought this African-American guy up front with me, and there were two empty seats across the aisle from one another. He sat in one, I sat in the other, and there were hoots and decries from around the bus, nigger lover, and all kinds of smarmy things. The woman seated at the window seat next to me said that she's fixing to get off. Would I mind moving? So I stood up in the aisle, and she moved over and occupied both seats, put her legs up. The next stop came and went, and she didn't move. I said, "Pardon me, ma'am, but you're taking two seats." So, "Well, I got tintillations in my legs, and I needed to stretch them out." So the bus filled up and people were standing in the aisle, and I finally appealed to her good nature and said, "There are people standing. Wouldn't you yield for somebody who's standing?" So she growled and she moved over and occupied the aisle seat. And there was an African-American woman standing just beyond us, and I gestured to her, motioned that here was an empty seat. She looked about, finally decided she'd do it, and she sat next to this white woman. Howls of protest went through the bus. The next stop, and at each stop we came to, there were these White Citizens League people holding up their placards, denouncing us, hooting us. The bus driver got off and ran to the sheriff, who was protecting the White Citizens Council. The sheriff came on board, grabbed me by my throat hole and said, "You a nigger lover, son?" "I love all people," I lied. He turned to this woman and said, "He been bothering you?" "No, Sheriff, he ain't been bothering me." "Well, I understand he has been bothering you." "Well, Sheriff, I got to go. My folks are waiting for me in Texas." "That's okay. This bus ain't going nowhere until you gets off and signs the statement we'll have ready for you." So she got up and tintillations and all, ran to the squad car and was taken off. I never saw her again. I was taken into the private office of Judge U. Mallory, told that I would have to post $3,000 in bond, and of course I had barely 30 cents on my person, and otherwise I'd have to wait until she came back from Texas a couple months from now. So I was thrown into a cell. I was grateful it was a single. I didn't have to share with anyone. I got through the night hearing all kinds of growlings from other prisoners. Then I realized this was a white-only section of the jail. Everything was segregated in the South, and especially justice. So in the morning, they opened the cell doors, and we were going in. Went into the white bullpen. People shouted at me, "What's you here for, shitface? You from Chicago?" No, I'm sorry. They said, "You from New York?" "No, I'm from Chicago." "Oh, Chicago, same thing." And the banter began. Before they could get very far in it, however, the warden came alongside the bullpen with two guys who were reeling. They were visibly inebriated. And they started pointing me out and said, "There he is, there's the goddamn fucking freedom rider," and other denunciatory language. I told the white prisoners that I had threatened to put their wives, their mothers, their sisters, their daughters into bed with black men, that I was going to destroy the way of the South. I was going to bring to the South the rioting and the crime that was rampant up north. You know, I said, "Who are these people? We here are members of the Ku Klux Klan. I know you heard of us, you cringy kike. You trying to come to our town, tell us how to live our lives. Coons down here perfectly happy. Ever hear any complaints from any niggers down here?" And other such language. And it just poured out all this invective and all this hatred. I tried to recite a psalm. They ripped the Bible out of my hands, knocked me down. The warden said, "You got to take it easy on him. Don't leave any marks. The FBI's been asking about him." So I got another blows to my solar plexus. I could barely breathe. Hit my ears so hard I could hardly hear. And this went on for a while. And then it stopped, because a porter named Dave came to mop the floors. So long as Dave was there mopping the floors, I would live. He mopped them good and clean, and then finally he had to retreat, and then they started up again. And the warden came back and said, "It's okay, boys, you don't have to worry about leaving marks. We got a necktie party waiting for him outside. If you don't leave here feet first, you ain't leaving this town no other way." And that's when the beatings really began in earnest. Threw me down on the ground, stomped on me, broke every rib in my body. I was in pain. I was in agony, saved only by Dave, who came back to mop the floors a bit. But I was going in and out of consciousness, because when he wasn't there, they were whooping me. I remember singing freedom songs to keep me going, thinking of my kids back home, thinking that their father would have died for something of which they could be proud. Singing, humming to myself, "Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave," I felt something against my cheek, my corduroy pants. "I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." Dave shouted from the outside the bars, "Your lawyers are here." Solomon Say Jr., Fred Gray, and Charles Conley, three wonderful African American civil rights lawyers came to carry me out of that jail cell, carry me through a mob that was waiting outside, huge white mob standing in front of the Dallas County Courthouse, and across the street from them, an equally large mob of African Americans. I don't know what would have happened, but my lawyers and some law enforcement officials, some FBI people, took me between these two mobs back to a convoy of their cars, drove me back to drove me back to Montgomery. Ralph David Abernathy, minister, First Baptist Church in Montgomery, strong member of SCLC, and his wife took me in their arms, put me in their bed, a nice soft bed, and they slept elsewhere. Black doctors took care of me for a week and a half until I could be flown north to a hospital in Chicago. Well, the Freedom Riders transformed America, but mostly they transformed those of us who were in the Freedom Rides, because we learned so much. The philosophy that you heard earlier today from Jim Lawson, who was really our leader, who was really the articulator of the purpose and the cause. The beautiful thing about the Freedom Riders is, like the revolution we saw in Cairo, it came from the people. That's why I had to support it. It came from the grassroots. And they spread a love of which I was incapable, addressing these thugs. But they came with a love that transformed America. I'm so proud to have been part of it.
Thank you, Professor Fertig, for sharing that with us. It's truly a heart-rending story. I would like now to have 5 minutes for Ray to actually speak on why he decided really to write the history of the Freedom Riders, and why also he's encouraged to place it in a film so that we can all see the history unfolding on our very screens. So it's really, it's a really important moment for us to have him here. And he's traveled from Florida, so he's come a long way to actually be with us here today. And so we're very pleased that he's here. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here. I was actually originally supposed to keynote a conference in Tunisia today, which was canceled. But I look forward to going back there later. You know, after being immersed in the Freedom Rider experience for the last 12 years, really taken over my life, you would think I would be immune to the emotion of stories like the ones you just heard. And after a life of activism of my own, but after hearing Reverend Lawson this morning and from Professor Fertig and Helen, it just reminds me of the power of the Freedom Rider story. I have a story as well, which is not nearly as interesting, but I will sort of try to give you a sense of how I came to write this book. I'm a transplanted New Englander who has spent most of his life in the South, and I always felt a little bit out of place. I went to 12 different schools before I graduated from high school, and I had a lot of conflict along the way with respect to race and civil rights. My earliest memory, I think, was the origins of this. I lived in Pensacola, Florida in 1956. The year of the Montgomery bus boycott, and my maternal grandmother, who was this little wisp of a woman, 4'10", but tough as nails, fancied herself as a neo-abolitionist from Boston, And I'll never forget, I was 8 years old. She would insist on sitting in the back of the bus. We were almost always the only whites in the back of the bus, of the city buses of Pensacola. And obviously I didn't understand what was going on. I just saw the stares and the comments. But it made me very proud of her later when I realized why she was doing what she was doing. 2 years later, we moved to Virginia, and I lived in a small community that had a number of migrant workers, kids, many of them smaller than I was, working in the bean fields. And I remember trying to process that information. How could they be out there picking beans when I was going off to school? And then in 1961, I actually lived in Washington when the first original Freedom Ride left. We had just moved there, and I can remember seeing the pictures of the burning bus in Anniston, trying to figure this out. I can remember I was from Cape Cod originally, born in Hyannis, where the Kennedys are from, so I kind of trusted the Kennedys. I thought I sympathized with the goals of the Freedom Riders, but I didn't know quite why they were doing this in such a provocative way. I thought, can't they wait for the Kennedys to solve these problems? I was a naive 13-year-old. But and then in 1967, when I was an undergraduate, I was a busboy at Princeton in the dining halls, and if you're a good busboy, you get promoted to be a captain, and you make the other people swab the tables. Well, I was not a very good busboy, but I was a scholarship student, and they still had to find a job for me, so I became a research assistant for this young, in Southern history and civil rights, with this young professor who was from Birmingham. His wife was from Montgomery. They were close friends of Rosa Parks, and at 19 years old, I got thrown into this world of civil rights activists, white and black, that I scarcely knew existed, and it obviously transformed my life. And that's the first time I heard about the Freedom Rides. And it's a story that captivated me. And years later, after I'd gone on and written many other things, two of my former professors were starting a book series at Oxford University Press called Pivotal Moments in American History. And the idea behind this series was to recapture the art of storytelling. They felt that historians had come to put too much stress on impersonal, powerful, socioeconomic forces, that we'd forgotten about the individual in history, particularly about the notion of contingency, of one event being contingent on another, the idea that small groups of people or individuals, through acts of courage and conviction and commitment, can change the course of history. And so they asked me to be one of the first authors in this series, and they said, do you have a pivotal moment for us? And I said, yes, I do. I want to write a book on the Freedom Rides. Amazingly, it was 30-odd years after the Freedom Rides, and no one had ever written a book or even a scholarly article. And I felt that was shocking, but a great opportunity. Once I got into the story, I was as naive as most historians. I knew about the original 13 Freedom Riders. I didn't know about the other 423. I think if I'd known there were 436 Freedom Riders, more than 60 Freedom Rides, that this was a mass movement, I don't think I would have had the courage to tackle this book. It took me 10 years to write it. My daughters are still asking me when I'm going to get off the bus. And I keep saying, I'm riding this bus to the end. And I want to thank those of you who read my book. I know it's a pretty daunting enterprise, such a big book, but I'm here to tell you, maybe I shouldn't tell you, that this week we just published the abridged version. Okay? So, for those of you who haven't encountered it yet, it's not quite the Cliff Notes version, but it's an incredible shrinking book. But I hope even though it's abridged, it captures at least some of the power of this story. It has moved me in a way that I don't think anything has ever moved me in my life. And I think when you see the film, which is a remarkable achievement, it was extraordinarily difficult to make this film, and I worked with the filmmakers for the last 2 years on it. To somehow to capture the empowering nature of what the Freedom Riders did in 1961. If you think about it, In some of the showings, we give out T-shirts that have big yellow letters on the front. Could you get on the bus? Question mark. Think about it, being 18, 19 years old and not being willing to pass the responsibility off to someone else, a neighbor, a stranger, the next generation, to make out your last will and testament, but to be willing to die for what seemed to be an abstract principle, but which had real meaning in people's lives. And of course, it was, as you'll see in the film, I know those of you who've read the book and who've listened to Reverend Lawson and to Professor Fertig and Helen, it was never really about the buses. It was the first step in a long road to freedom. It was about human dignity and about the capacity of human beings to take themselves outside of themselves, to see a higher principle, a deeper meaning in life. So I think I'm so pleased to see so many of you. I'm really humbled in your presence. I run a graduate program with 40 students, so I'm a little overwhelmed here. But it's just, I feel better about the world knowing that there are 1,000 social workers like you who are going to be out there fighting the good fight. So thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Ralph. Now we're opening the floor to questions, so please, the microphones is where they usually are, so please stand up and ask your question. We also have the virtual community who's taking part in this, so we are so pleased to have them be part of this all-school day. So we'd like to welcome them. Let's give them a round of applause too. Thank you. Okay, please.
As not only a social worker, but a parent of teenagers who themselves see the inequalities and feel very inadequate in being capable of affecting some type of change, what type of, I don't know, suggestions do you have for those younger generations to continue this in a way that hopefully sees it so my grandchildren don't have these experiences?
Okay. Anyone feel like they would like to answer?
I could say just something. I'm speaking as a professor now, but I think the beginning is to encourage them to have a bit of knowledge. Knowledge is power in this case. My own students, I think most people generally in the United States are encouraged not to pay attention to the details like the Freedom Riders of the past, but to be part of a niche market, to be predictable consumers, predictable voters, predictable human beings. I think when you learn about something like the Freedom Riders, you become unpredictable. You become an inquisitive, active citizen, and you become a dangerous person in the best sense. And so I think that's the beginning, is to know your history. You know the past, you have at least have a chance of knowing where you're going or where you might like to go.
Thank you, Helen. Sorry, Ralph. Helen?
I just want to add to that. When I'm asked that question, I tell pretty much what he said, and that is, go with your passion. It may not be a matter of tearing down a sign that segregates people, but it's whatever you feel strongly about. And as he said, develop yourself, and your issue will come to you naturally.
Thank you.
The ability of black parents to transfer wealth forward to their children is being compromised. This is the first generation of American blacks where things are not getting better. It's the third generation of the school-to-prison pipelines that's destroying families, neighborhoods, and communities. In the 60s and 70s, when we were out there in the streets, 5% of blacks were in prison and 12% in schools. Those figures are now reversed. In 2003, newborn black males had a 1 in 4 chance of going to prison in their lifetimes, compared to 1 in 23 for white males. 4 years later, it was 32% chance of going to prison or jail. Things are getting worse for many people in the African American community, not just the African American, but also the Latino communities and other sectors in our society. There is so much to be done. There is so much to be done to correct the injustices of America. There's no shortage of issues to address, whether it's health care or preschool or mental health services or any other sectors of social work into which you will be going. You will find enormous, staring in your face, inequities in the allocation of resources, opportunities. Address that. Make that part of your mission of social work.
Okay. Thank you. Could we have the gentleman over there, please?
Thank you. I think I can speak for all my classmates when I say we're very grateful to have the fuller version of the Freedom Riders, all 700 pages of it.
You've made my whole day.
In reading your book, I was really surprised to see often the disconnect between the efforts of the NAACP and CORE. There was the route by the courts to fight for equality, and then there was the route to go into the streets and practice pacifism to fight for equality. But often there was it would seem like there was a contention between the two camps. I'm wondering if you can speak to why you felt there was such a disconnect between those two camps, and in what ways today we have organizations that share similar goals, but there's kind of a silo effect in that there's a lack of collaboration, and what we can do to push through that barrier.
Okay,
well, I would say there are probably a number of possible answers to your question, but for me the most important reality is that the stakes were so high. When you're fighting for freedom, for things such as self-respect and human dignity, there's probably not as much of a tendency to compromise because you feel everything is on the line. So I think they sincerely had different points of view about what was the best way, to push down a little farther down the road to freedom. Not unlike the Constitutional Convention of 1787. No detail was too small to fight over. And I think in some ways it's remarkable how during the Freedom Rides the different factions, different personalities, different philosophies were able to come together ultimately and to see that if at that moment they had to put away their differences. It took them a while to do it, but after the siege at the First Baptist Church in Montgomery, I think it's a remarkable coming together. It didn't last in many senses, but it showed that it was possible, that people could compromise their philosophies. Thurgood Marshall, who was one of the most severe critics of the Freedom Rides, ultimately was the person who found the way to find money to keep the Freedom Rides going when they were nearly collapsed in August and September of 1961. So I think that says volumes about ultimately the depth of the commitment despite the differing philosophies. But it's probably not surprising at all if we look truthfully at the history of the movement.
I would like to say, too, that it worked very well while we were in jail, that we had been trained by the Congress of Racial Equality. As they mentioned, these sociodramas that we went through in which we were assaulted to see how we would respond. That was CORE's forte, direct action. But the NAACP joined with CORE during the Freedom Rides and sent lawyers to visit us while we were in jail. And we were only allowed to be visited by two different types of people, either your lawyer or your minister. And I want to give you a little light note here. While I was incarcerated in Parchman, we were allowed to be visited by a priest or a rabbi or a Protestant minister. And after about 3 or 4 weeks, the priest had come several times and the rabbi had come several times, but no Protestant minister had come, and I'm a Baptist. So I did what you do in these circumstances. The next time the trustee called out we were on maximum security. So it was just this one corridor. And when the trustee called and said, the rabbi's here, y'all call out y'all number. And my number of my cell was 7. So I called it out. And the doors clanged open and I stepped out into the corridor. And the trustee looked at me and she said, I know you're not Jewish, but your soul needs to be saved, so come on out here and see this rabbi. And the rabbi was not allowed to tell us anything that was going on in the outside world. But the warden stood on one side and the trustee stood on the other. And the rabbi talked to, it was about 7 Jewish girls and me. And he would say things that rabbis say. And then he would turn to the warden and say, so I can't tell them that Roger Maris just hit his 61st and 62nd home run. And the warden would say, no, you can't tell him that. And he went on with his ministrations and then turned to the warden and he would say something else that represented what was going on in the outside world. And the warden never caught on. But I just want to answer your question. The NAACP and CORE did put aside their differences with respect to the best way to approach the situation, and they worked together.
I'd just like to, you'll see this in the movie this afternoon, but I wanted to call your attention to it so you know what's happening, because it's treated rather lightly in the movie. Yes, CORE and NAACP and SNCC did in the end come together, but there was that very critical moment after the violence that was undertaken in Birmingham and then replicated in Montgomery, where everyone was saying, that's it. We can't subject people to further violence like this. Call it off. And it came from the White House. It came from all the civil rights organizations. There was one place in America that vowed that we cannot back down in the face of violence, and that was in Nashville, Tennessee, under the leadership of Jim Lawson. That was the place that stood solid and persistent and said, we will not back down in the face of violence. Had it not been for Jim Lawson and Diane Nash and the people in Nashville, the freedom rides would have ended in infamy, in intimidation. And we owe Jim Lawson the greatest ever.
Indeed.
Okay, could we have another question, please?
Yes, hi, good morning. I want to first thank Professor Fertig and Ms. Singleton and Mr. Arsenault, as well as Reverend Larson, for just taking the journey and responding to your cause, and that brought us here today. I really want to thank you on behalf of USC. My question is that as we, as social workers, go head on with trying to fight for social change, the question that comes up for me is cultural competency. And I think that on the one hand, that we can take the African American culture and their struggle and we can see what that civil rights fight is about. How can we as social workers come together? Because for Hispanic cultures as well as Asian cultures, there's always been a struggle or some kind of plight. What can you suggest to us as social workers how to work through that? I know that Reverend Larson said we have to go around, under, and even probably over before we become violent, so we don't become violent. What is your suggestion to us as struggling social workers? How do we work with families and children to where we are trying to overcome social competency?
Okay, well, would you like to start, Ralph?
Well, I think social competency consists of that, it's fundamental, consists of approaching people with dignity and respect for them and for where they are and for what they're doing, and respecting their need to be themselves. I think that we are enablers, but we're enablers of something that takes people beyond where they are. We start with people where they are, but we have a moral code, we have a code of honor that compels our compassion and our understanding of the distress and the turmoil that people feel within themselves, but to carry them beyond that. That's why social workers are the natural heirs to the freedom rides. You conduct a freedom ride every time you see a client.
Okay, thank you. Helen?
I'm not sure I know what you mean by social competency, but I would say that it is in your own interest and the interest of those with whom you work to learn as much about them and where they're coming from, what their experience has been, and why they are one of your clients, for instance. And so it is just in the best interest of the field, as well as yourself and the people with whom you work, to not only learn as much as you can about them, but as we've said several times here, to respect the condition that they find themselves in and treat them with dignity. Our whole experience as freedom riders was one in which we were fighting for our own dignity. Every time I saw a sign that said, colored go around the back, I felt diminished a little. And if I went around the back, it was like I was agreeing with them that I was less of a person. So I would say there's, learn all you can, and I keep saying that because I'm in a university setting here, but don't just read the textbooks. That's not really where you're going to find out everything that's going to make you a good social worker. You must go deeper than that. I'm not saying go into the streets where you might just talk to someone, but that's not a bad idea either. One good way to learn about what's going on in the community is just go sit on a bus stop and talk to whoever sits beside you.
I would just add a brief word. It's a word that I kept coming up to again and again in my years of research on the Freedom Riders. It's the word generosity, a kind of generosity of spirit. I've seen it among the Freedom Riders when they get together, although, as Helen suggests, the individual notion of being diminished yourself was certainly a part of the generating spirit, but I think just the mutuality, the sense of, again, of being generous to other human beings, giving them the benefit of the doubt, opening yourself to them. I saw this in the Freedom Rider story again and again, and I think that might be a good role model for social workers, at least as a beginning.
Okay. Thank you. Now, we've only got a very short time left, and I know that some people have burning questions. So I can take the questions with the people standing only if they make them very short. Have I got that promise from you? Yes, okay. So please, if it's short, that's fine. I can take it. Okay.
This is from Virtual Academic Center student Carla Bruton in Arizona.
She wanted to know what was the impact or what was your family's reactions when you decided, I want to be a freedom rider, and then as they're watching the news, they're hearing about the bombings, they're hearing that you're in jail. What was the reaction? Were they joining the cause? Was there, just kind of talking about that?
Okay. Many of the students, as he said before, many of the people who volunteered to go were students. And many of them were under age 21. So my husband Bob was president of the UCLA NAACP and a member of Los Angeles Corps. So when we got the word, he was the recruiter on UCLA's campus. And most of the people in our group were UCLA students. However, when they decided to go, many of them had to call their parents and ask because they were under 21. And so we started out with 42 people going on in the group we were in. We ended up with 17 because they called home. Fortunately, Bob was a graduate student. He was 25. I was at Santa Monica City College. I won't say how old I was. But I was over 21, and we called our parents the night before we were leaving. Not to ask, but to tell them. My mother just couldn't believe it. She had seen the news like everyone else. And she said, "But why are you doing this?" And I'm sorry to say I was young enough to be brash. And I said, "Mom, if you had done something, I wouldn't have to." And what I didn't realize is that she had done something. She was one of the 6 million black people who left the South and migrated to the North so that their children could have a better life. And I was one of those who had grown up. In fact, if I hadn't been raised in Philadelphia, I wouldn't have probably had the nerve to be insulted and indignant about all the things I saw when I went down south. So she was quiet on the other end of the line, but she didn't say, "Don't go." But my father, I can't repeat in public what he said. Just that he was quite upset because he had 5 sons. I have 5 brothers. And over time, being black, and even though you're in the North, you're likely to get arrested at some point. And my parents were both active in Philadelphia politics and local politics. My father was a ward leader or something like that. But whenever one of my older brothers or one of my younger brothers had gotten into a little trouble and been arrested, my father could go down to City Hall and talk to somebody because they knew him and say, "Get my son out of there." He didn't do it. What my father was so upset about was that he couldn't come down to Mississippi and get his baby out of jail. At least that's how he referred to us all as his baby. So yes, it wasn't easy for most parents, and it was definitely not easy for mine.
Only problem in my family was my wife wanted to go too. We had 3 small infant children, and we just concluded it was wiser for her to stay with the kids. While I was recuperating in Reverend Abernathy's home, however, she blocked the street, State Street, downtown Chicago, protesting some segregated housing that the city was sponsoring in the form of building a huge complex going down State Street that was a black ghetto created by public housing. And when they hauled her off to the jail, she wept and said, "My husband was half killed. He's resting in Reverend Abernathy's home down in Alabama." And she poured out this story of distress. They let her go.
Thank you. Well, we have our final question, a short one. Yes, okay.
This question also comes from Don Halliburton, another VAC student in Colorado. And the question is, recently, research has shown that there's an increase from U.S. soldiers to return from Iraq and Afghanistan of joining right-wing extremist groups. And she just wants your thoughts on what that means to you.
I didn't quite hear the question.
Well, it means that the military culture is winning out. You're fighting a war, you have to depersonalize the persons against whom you're directed. You have to hate them. You certainly can't love people if you're supposed to police them and shoot them down. And we're letting that culture seep into the consciousness of people that we're sending off to fight for democracy. Those of you who are working in military social work, you have an awesome task and an essential one. Very essential, because you're dealing with the individual and how he reconciles this culture of violence of which he's become a part with a conscience. And I wish you well. You've got a very heavy task and a heavy burden.
Thank you. Would you like to say anything, anyone else on the panel? No? Okay. All right. Okay, thank you very much. So, I would like to thank our panel for joining us today and for sharing with us their experiences and for answering our questions. We now have a better understanding of the Freedom Riders and the role that they play as civil rights activists. They have given their account of how segregation during that time affected everyone that cared about social justice, both black and white people. Also, how nonviolent action in protest can also change the course of history. In every generation, there are people who can change ideas into reality. We hope that as social workers, that we develop these skills, that we can stop injustice and work towards a more equitable society. I'd like to thank everyone for making today such a great day for us. I'm sure you'd agree this is indeed a really wonderful time. I had special thanks to Dean Flynn, Reverend Lawson, Dean Sony, and of course our panelists. And last but not least, to the All School Day Committee, who's been very helpful and supportive in organizing this event. So I'll ask them to stand so that we can give them a round of applause. Please stand.
We'll get KD up here to lead us and you show overcome.
Oh, we will do. We're going to in the end. Before I hand over the podium to Juliet and Christy, I'd like to make one quick announcement. As many of you know, the School of Social Work offers 5 unique opportunities to travel, work, and study globally. This year, our program will include Europe, the Philippines, and the UK. If you're interested in any of these programs, please do not hesitate to see either Dan Hester, Susan Cornwall, or myself. This is indeed a great opportunity for everyone to take part and also to learn about other cultures and also to see how race relations in certain countries actually work and to see that after all we are one world and that we should take the responsibility of being human beings in that world. So thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, so if I have Christy up here. Oh, okay. And Juliet, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Juliet Bowie. I'm the Vice President of Student Org. So Christy and I have a few announcements to make as we wrap up this extraordinary event. And I wish I had asked Mr. Solomon to give these announcements just so I could hear his voice again. So first and most importantly, lunch. Lunch will be served on the lawn of the Davidson Conference Center, and that building is between the parking structure that's next to the Social Work Center and Figueroa. There's going to be a mass exodus over there, so just make sure to go with the group. The other thing is, along with your program, you had 2 sheets of paper on your seat. One of them is the all-school day evaluation, and the other is the student diversity survey. So please make sure you take a moment to fill these both of these out. There are boxes by the exits for you to drop them in, or you can give them to any of the volunteers that have on gray t-shirts like mine. All right. So last Tuesday, if you're on campus, you noticed in our social work courtyard that we were holding a contest to sort of raise awareness about the themes that we were discussing today. And I'm pleased to announce that the winner of that contest is the Latino Social Work Caucus. Congratulations. And of course, I want to recognize the other student groups that participated in that contest as well. Part-time Social Work Caucus, Clinical Social Work Caucus, Black Social Work Caucus, and the Military Social Work Interest Group. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to turn the microphone over briefly to Tom Franco and Leah Evans from the Rainbow Alliance Caucus, who have an announcement.
The bullying, the suicides, the murders, the discrimination, the lack of our rights as being part of the LGBT community needs to stop. The USC School of Social Work, Rainbow Alliance Caucus, our mission is to bring awareness to these areas. This past year we had in the Trevor Project. We recently had a panel on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Our final accumulation for this year will be recognition of staff, of faculty, who weave into their curriculum awareness of LGBT issues. We need every single person in this room to do something, and it starts within your family system, to encourage, to mentor, to help get the LGBT community to where it is, so we do no longer have the violation of our equal rights under the United States Constitution. We are here today to thank those of you who participated at our tabling to raise some funds through donations to the Rainbow Alliance Caucus. Our give back to you, to the winner that we will be drawing out of this bag in just a moment, a $30 award certificate for C's Candies, and in addition to that, a little candy bar. And one last thing, we need representation from Orange County, from San Diego, from the Skirball campus, and from the Virtual Academic Center. We are here for you. We're on Facebook. We'd like you to come forward and help us out. So the next leadership, which Leah Evans is a nominee for representation as nominee for chair for next year, as is Wendell Schiffman, who is sitting in the audience, as well as my fantastic board, co-chaired by Timothy Fisher, and Melanie Walker, treasurer of the Rainbow Alliance Caucus. I'm sorry to take up this much time. It's important. And right now we'll do the drawing. And whoever has the winner, please come forward on stage.
And the winner is Elizabeth Mota. Hey. Thank you, Rainbow Alliance. So just very quickly, the rest of the announcements. I heard many students asking questions like, how can we best advocate? What can we do as social workers? And I'm glad you asked, because in April, we'll be joining a large group of over 1,000 social work students and professionals to take over Sacramento and the state capitol for legislative info days. We'll be learning about the legislative process and, more importantly, advocating for our profession and for our clients. So I'm guessing by the round of applause that many of you have already registered, and I'm happy to hear that. If there was someone around you that wasn't clapping, now's your chance to practice advocacy and encourage them to sign up for this trip. We're going to have an information table during lunch, so come ask questions. Speaking of the afternoon, some of the compelling clips that we watched earlier today come from a documentary called Freedom Riders, and if you notice on the clip it said May 2011. Well, thanks to Professor Fertig and members of the All School Day Committee, we are able to watch the film today. So we'd love to invite and encourage all faculty, staff, and all the students here to join us for that film screening this afternoon. It's going to be in the Embassy Room of the Davidson Conference Center, so enjoy your lunch on the Davidson lawn and then come inside and catch the film. I'm also pleased to say that we're lucky to have Professor Fertig, Raymond Arsenault, and Dean Soni as well joining us for a panel discussion afterwards. So if you had some questions that you'd like to ask, there's another chance for you too. VAC students, you'll have a chance to watch the film as well, but I think it will be available in another way. But the panel will be live streamed, so please catch us later this afternoon, and you can email questions to the email address that's posted. So I'm going to turn it over to Christy for the other afternoon event.
Hi, everyone. I'd just like to start off by thanking Cherry Short and all of the panel members today, because I think that they really did a great job in communicating the message that we still have a long way to go, but through their dedication and their works, you know, they serve as inspiration for all of us, and we can live in a better world because of them. So let's just give them one more round of applause. Thank you. So today we've really kind of been talking about advocacy and the power of our voice and what change that can bring about. And so for our second afternoon event, it's a diversity and social media event, and it's going to be held in Hamovich from 12 to 4. So you can trickle in, you know, throughout the day as you eat lunch, or if you want to go see the Freedom Riders video and then come back. What it is basically is we're filming. Each student is going to have 1 minute to respond to the question, what does justice and equality mean to you? And that can be anything that you've experienced in the past, prejudices, good or bad. It can be what you're seeing in your field, you know, in your line of work, or it can be your hopes for the future. And through this, we're trying to get 101 social work students together on film so that we can put this together in sort of a video collective and really show LA. It's going to go on the USC website. It's going to be shopped around. The Daily Trojan newspaper is doing a piece on it, and also an opportunity to use on your resume, which is always good. So it's really just a chance to get out and use your voice and for a good cause. So thank you. Full of announcements. 2 other quick things. Mako from the San Diego campus, you left your purse at the bookstore. So head over there after that. And I would just really proudly like to call up Mr. Solomon on stage again one more time so we can hear his beautiful, deep voice, and he can sing us another amazing song.
As I was listening to, as I was listening to my brother Lawson speak, I was thinking, what should I sing? And one song kept ringing through my ears was The Impossible Dream. Maybe taken a little out of context, but the meaning is simply this. We must fight the unbeatable foe. And I'd say the foe is not unbeatable, but it keeps us as a community divided between cultures and parties. And I really believe that the answer, the power, is in the people, as they showed in Egypt. We don't have to raise a gun. The answer is simply we have to care about each other. Simple as that. We have to have a little love for each other. And we can change this nation and change the world. So I'm honored to share this song with you. I dedicate it to the Freedom Riders, Dr. Lawson, to the Dean, all of you adults, young adults. Dream the impossible dream. Go ahead and fight without guns and knives, with love, passion, understanding, respect, honor for your fellow human being. To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to right the unrightable wrong, to love pure and chaste from afar, to try when your arms are too weary, to reach the unreachable star. This is my quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for that heavenly cause. And I know if I only be true to this glorious quest, then my heart will lie peaceful and calm when I'm laid to my rest. And the world will be better for this, that one man, scorned and covered with scars, still strove with his last ounce of courage to reach the unreachable star. Keep fighting. And finally, hallelujah, I'm riding. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, I'm riding down freedom's main line. Hallelujah,